Thank you, Jill, and thanks, Carl, and the organizers for inviting me to the symposium. So what I like to focus on, certainly it's a continuation of John's on human locomotion, certainly addressing the area of coordination, certainly as an essential component of movement forms, especially the role of variability in coordination and how it affects certainly healthy gait, but also addresses issues related to aging. First, I'd like to acknowledge, as a lot of us have done, my graduate, doctoral student, Scott Descharnes, who's had an important, certainly contribution, essential contribution in the component of the talk that relates to the fractal dynamics that I'll talk about briefly. So three major components to my talk. First, kind of reviewing what we know about and certainly what are the key issues regarding the role of variability in locomotion. The second component is a bit of a tutorial, but certainly creates some key insights into fractals and how fractal dynamics are associated with adaptability, adaptive movement patterns. And then three, we'll test that. So these are some of Scott's experiments that he did recently in the lab. So we'll actually some empirical testing of some of the predictions of fractal dynamics and how they certainly are supposed to be linked with adaptive movement behaviors, and in our case, adaptive locomotor behaviors. So this is a slide typically taken from the literature. This is from Kang and Dingwall, but I've sort of gotten many different experiments showing the changes in variability as a function of aging. So if we compare older and younger individuals on key characteristic variables, and these are output variables. I have to disappoint Mark on this. They are not the neurocontrol variables. But on key variables like stride time, step length, step width, variability in these variables typically is elevated in older individuals compared to younger controls. And what's good here in this study is it's shown across a variety of speeds, because typically this is compared to preferred speed that could impact variability. But in this study, they controlled for that. So they looked at this at a variety of speeds above and below preferred. So this is definitely typical finding in the literature. Variability increases. Moreover, in a very powerful prospective cohort study by Verghese and Owen in 2009, they showed also that variability, in this case of stride length and stride time, are predictive, or swing time, are predictive of falls in older individuals. So powerful message that certainly variability is quote-unquote bad or detrimental, certainly associated with aging, but in this case predictive of falls as well. The question from all of these studies, however, is should variability not have this bad rap? So clearly there are issues with certainly increased variability can have these detrimental effects. But should that be the kind of underlying message that we then, and which is certainly happening in the literature, both clinical and basic research. So in order to address this, I'll have two tags. First, and this is really the focus maybe of the symposium in terms of movement forms, the argument that we need to look at variability at different locations, different levels of the system. Output variability can be very different from what we call coordinate variability, and this certainly was recognized very early on in the work of Bernstein already. Second, and that's the center part of the talk, is we really need to look at the structure variability. This is our fractal dynamics, certainly nonlinear system dynamics, that Lee talked a little bit about already, come in. So even if we look at these step parameters, the stride parameters, we need to look at the structure of the variation and not necessarily just the absolute level of that. And that's the argument we'll be making today. So as a starter, I'll just review. This is a very cursory overview. There's tons of studies now that examine variability, coordinate variability in different populations. So I think this is a good start because this is where John ended on Parkinson's disease. This is actually one of my earliest studies where we looked at recently diagnosed patients with Parkinson's disease. So these were highly functional, not showing any of the symptoms yet that John showed, so thanks for the videos. You couldn't probably see they had Parkinson's, but what we detected was clear differences already in how they coordinated their movements, especially how they coordinate the upper body. So the relative motion between the trunk and the pelvis is already affected. There's less of a relative motion and less of an adaptation when they speed up. So when you have to walk on a treadmill, they go from slow to fast speed, that coordination changes less. And this is what we claim is associated with axial rigidity. But what was interesting is that the variability is also lower in the Parkinson patients. As you see, Parkinson's versus control, whereas we showed no changes or differences in the stride parameters. So the stride parameter variability was the same. So again, John, maybe one of the explanations why the Dutchman is, of course, it's a nice example, was able to bike was not only because they started biking at 3 months of age, but they also don't need as much trunk control to do this. So definitely there are issues with the control of the upper body, and that could be facilitated, certainly when people, or just less of an issue when people are biking. But clearly he showed other capabilities like stepping off his bike pretty quickly. So I think the upper body plays a significant role in addition to controlling, of course, the lower extremities. It was kind of the first pieces of evidence that decreased variability is associated with a lack of coordinate changes or adaptability. This is a study from Say et al. On a very different population. These are runners with low back pain. What we showed there is that systematically, when we compare a control group to a runner's group with low back pain, and also to a runner's group that had low back pain, but where the low back pain was resolved, so currently they were not undergoing pain, we see systematic reductions in the coordination variability from the control to the resolve to the current low back pain group at a variety of different gait speeds. And we interpret that in the context of coordination or relative motion, that for the control participants, the motion is more in the form of relative coordination, mostly adaptable. And when you go to the resolve, it becomes a little less. So this is based on von Hol's principle. So a bit more adaptive, and then when you go to the low back pain group, it becomes more absolute, less adaptive. In the other study that's more recent, we linked these coordinate dynamics to perceptual aspects, and in this case, and this is what Ben Lieberman was talking about yesterday, controlled head motion, and the stabilization of head motion. So in this experiment, we systematically increased the demands between different conditions on the motion of the head, having to keep the head motion within targets of increasing or decreasing size, of decreasing visual angle. And without going into the details of this experiment, what we showed was that there are systematic adaptations to these visual demands on the head, in this case especially in late stands. So we use a technique called statistical parametric mapping that shows that in the propulsive phase of stands, we see clear adaptation, in this case, how the hip and the knee are coordinated and how they vary in that process. The final example is work from our group in conjunction with researchers at the University of Bath in England, and this is on expert performance. And in this case, what we show is that within the same performer, we see different variability patterns depending on whether we talk about the stance phase or the swing phase. And this is the hop step component in the triple jump. What we had here was a number of triple jumpers, all elite performers. They performed at the world level, at world performance level. What we see here is that the coordination variability in the stance phase increases as a level of skill. So this is personal best indicates what their performance, their best performance is. So during stance, variability increases between the hip and the knee, but during swing it decreases. There's no uniform pattern of variability change even here within the performers, within these elite performers. Okay? So in that case, there's not necessarily just a decrease or an increase in variability within an individual, within an activity. And of course, this is a bit more complicated than just walking, but it shows that this is what we have to study as well. So this is a little plug for Mark. I don't know if he will talk about this. So of course in the area of motor control, There's significant developments, in this case using techniques such as the M-control manifold, that try to parse out variability that's functional, that actually could maintain task performance, versus that variability that affects that task performance. The other key thing is that this approach allows us to relate coordinate variability to the outcome of the task, which in our view is, of course, a very important component. So that's not something I'll go into today, because I'm sure Mark will talk more about it, unless he's going to talk more about neural control aspects of things, but we'll see. All right, so kind of address the first component of the talk, is coordination variability, the significance of that. Clearly that work shows that increased variability is not associated with healthy pathology necessarily. I've showed you data that shows exactly the opposite. Or in the expert performance, we have at least different patterns. We have different variability changes as a result of where they are in their movement cycle. So the second part of the talk, I want to look a little bit more closely at the structure of variability question. And this goes back in terms of the work I described, back to the stride parameters. We're going to focus back on this, what I started with, showing the literature that there's increased variability with aging, and that these variability changes are predictive of falls and changes in gait in older individuals. But the argument here is that we really need to look at the nature of the fluctuations in that variation. So not necessarily just the absolute magnitude as we see here, which is still the bulk of the work, where the assumption is that on the left, it represents an unstable system, and on the right, so on the left it represents a stable system, and on the right it represents an unstable system. Okay. This is purely analysis or an assessment of the magnitude of the variations. But the argument here is that we need to look at the structure. So on the left there is stride fluctuations that are pretty much random, or certainly dominated by white noise. On the right there are so-called fractal fluctuations. Here there are certainly random fluctuations, but they also will show some pretty structured changes or persistence. If the stride interval goes up, it will tend to go up for a while, even though it fluctuates. So these are very typical patterns, what we call fractal dynamics. The essence of fractal dynamics is that fluctuations, in this case at different time scales, either short or long, are correlated. They're related. And the essential assumption is that this makes the system adaptable or complex, as Lee identified. But I want to stick at this point to adaptable systems, because we'll test that explicitly in the third part of the talk. Okay? So unstructured, structured, fractal. And the idea is that we need to determine what components of the observed stride dynamics really are observed. So to talk about fractals can be certainly organized spatially, like in the example on the left with the tree. So we see repetitive, repeating patterns across the entire system. On the left on the tree, on the right we're back to the stride intervals. So if we analyze stride intervals, say, over a longer period of time, the nature of the fluctuations will be similar to when we analyze it over a shorter period of time, like 200 strides or 50. That the way that the stride interval fluctuates is similar, shows self-similarity or shows fractal dynamics. And this can be analyzed in different ways. We can look at the scaling, because both in the tree and the fractal dynamics, the argument is that an average, either an average tree size of the limbs or the average size of the fluctuations, as has been done in most of the Gait literature on stride parameter fluctuations, is not an adequate representation of the system. We need to look at the scaling properties. If we look at the effect of scale size here on, say, number, then certainly larger aspects of the tree trunk, larger branches, are in fewer numbers than smaller branches. The same thing with fluctuations. When we look at fluctuations over a longer time scale, those will be greater than fluctuations over a shorter time scale. So we need to look at the relationships. When they, in log-log space, show these linear relationships, we identify fractal dynamics. Or we can identify fractal dynamics. So here is an example of a relationship that in the analysis, and we'll use what's called detrended fluctuation analysis, that I can't go into the details, but what it does is looks at these correlations at increasingly longer or shorter timescales. So when that outcome of that fractal analysis is 1, we identify a structured complex system that's adaptable, and as you can see nicely, this is shown by what's called pink noise. When the dynamics are random, this is shown by an alpha of 0.5, and it's unstructured random, and it's basically white noise. Okay, what we do now in these analyses is identify the different sources of noise. This is the whole noise spectrum, at the bottom going from white to the top going to brown. This is brown noise. At the bottom, this is random, uncorrelated behavior. At the top, it's highly persistent, mechanical, very low variations compared to here. But somewhere in the middle is that fractal dynamics that we would see as optimal, reflecting an adaptable system. Okay? So what we end with is that we can't say variability high or low necessarily is bad. In this case, maybe both high and low variability are unwanted because too high is too random. Too low, these are alpha level, fractal levels of greater than 1. Too low, it becomes too mechanical. This is probably the problem with the robots. In the optimal range here, we'll see fractal dynamics around 1.0, and that would reflect an adaptive system. Okay? So this has been shown. So detrended fluctuation analysis is the key analysis to identify these fractal dynamics. And Jeff Hausdorff has done a lot of work on it, showing that both in aging, as we see here, when we compare old versus young, fractal dynamics in the older individuals are closer to 0.5, closer to random, and old closer to 1, in the younger closer to 1. We also see that in disease populations, in this case of Huntington's disease. The assumption from all this work is that this is an indicator, possible indicator, of the reduced capabilities, adaptive capabilities, of the gait patterns in the older or in this case Huntington's disease participants. Okay? But the question is that true and should that be tested? And that's exactly in the third part of this talk what we set out to do. So fractal behavior of gait variability. Assumption is that fractals, optimal fractality identifies interactions, optimal interactions across different scales. Those optimal interactions identify complex and adaptive systems and could be a potential marker of locomotor health. The current literature has shown differences in fractality, as I just showed the data, between older individuals, younger individuals, those with neurological conditions, and make the assumption, based on the fact that, yes, a patient with Parkinson's disease is less adaptive. It's never really been directly tested. So how do changes in fractal dynamics relate to adaptive behavior? And in the two experiments that I'll show you for the rest of this talk, based on Scott's dissertation work, we set out to really try to address these questions. In the first one, we had healthy young participants walk on a split belt treadmill. So the paradigm is a split belt treadmill where we can impose different frequencies between the legs. In our case, we had different conditions. One was preferred speed, the second one was half preferred speed, and the third was 3 asymmetric conditions where the preferred leg walked at preferred speed, the dominant leg at preferred, and the non-dominant leg walked at half preferred speed. Our measures, so we use detrended fluctuation analysis to look at the fractality, at the fractal dynamics, and we use adaptation on the treadmill because people eventually adapt. The gait pattern eventually is highly asymmetric, but over time, actually you basically adopt a regular symmetrical pattern where the phasing between the legs is kind of nicely anti-phase again. There's symmetry in some of the step variables. I can't go into the details of all these variables, how we calculated them, but we'll definitely can answer that later on. So here are some examples. This is pre-adaptation, so we put someone immediately on the treadmill. It's your task to figure out which leg is the fast one, which leg is the slow one. That's it. And this is post-adaptation. So again, so here in both cases, one of the belts, I'll tell you which one, goes twice as fast as the other. So that's pretty remarkable. I mean, that's a remarkable speed difference. And you can see nicely how, I mean, it's not purely symmetrical, but there's a high degree of symmetry between the legs in this case. So what we're analyzing here is how do people adapt to this? So at the end of the trials, how much phase deviation is there from optimal, which is 180 degrees antiphase, and how long did it take them to get there? This is what we call time to adaptation. So we have two key measures to assess adaptation. It's the phase deviation at the end of the trials, and it's the time to adapt to that. And so for the fractal analysis, we were interested to see where these numbers would fall under these different conditions, between 0.5 and 1 and 1.5. And here are some of the results. So first of all, on the left, we start with preferred speed. The fractality is about 0.7, 0.75, and this is typically observed in the literature, so it's not 1. That's still the debate. Why people actually, even healthy individuals, walk with less fractality than 1. And it's definitely still open and people trying to address that. But what we do see is when you move away from that preferred state, whether it's half preferred or on the split belt, that fractality goes up. So this is an interesting finding, and this has been observed in the literature before, but this is novel. So under conditions where we move people away from preferred, and this is both for the dominant and the non-dominant leg, the fractality goes up, goes closer to 1. Meaning there's a more, the correlational structure resembles more that of an optimal fractal structure with optimal correlations between the different time scales. Then when we look at the split belt conditions 2 and 3, because we had different conditions, there's kind of a readaptation back to preferred. But the key finding was that at preferred, this was our main question, at preferred there's no association between fractality and our adaptive behaviors, either in terms of phase deviation or time to adapt. So that prediction, or certainly that assumption in the literature, did not come out under these conditions, under this adaptation paradigm on the split belt. What we did find was that when we looked at the associations between fractality and phase deviation and time to adapt on the split belt, so under the more challenging Gait condition, we actually see nice quadratic relationships with a minimum, so best performance is 0 here, best performance is towards 0, so the minimum is around 1 in both cases. Not quite, there's some range, but the minimum goes towards 1, meaning that in those individuals who show fractality around 1, we see the best adaptation, that this is under challenging Gait conditions, not under preferred steady state conditions. So in conclusion, the dynamics during steady state do not seem to associate with fractality. It certainly has been proposed in the literature. They do seem to have some interesting and emerging relationships when we challenge Gait as under the split belt condition. The second experiment asked the question, what about older adults? Okay? So older adults, as we've shown before, Hausdorff and others, have reduced fractality. Their fractality is closer to 0.5 to random compared to young. How do they adapt to the split belt treadmill, and how does that relate to their fractality? What we know is that they certainly take longer in the split belt paradigm to adapt to this particular task. There's a study from Brown et al. So this is step length symmetry. Solid line is young adults. Dashed line is older adults. And we look at strides, number of strides. It takes a lot more time for the older adults to get to symmetry. Here at 0. And they don't really get as close as the younger adults. So clearly, they take longer and they have a harder time adapting to this paradigm. What we also did in this study is, and I made a comment at my last NAK talk, you don't remember that, but is to really, and this is a very important impact of Jane Kent's work and certainly impact on our thinking, is to really bring in aspects of physical activity and the components, certainly key considerations of the groups we're testing. So in this experiment, we had the unique comparison of two groups of all the young individuals who were completely matched for physical activity levels. They were highly physically active, both in terms of self-report and objective report. And we thought this was important to use as a control in our studies. What we show is that when you do that, our two groups are not different in terms of basic fractal dynamics at baseline at preferred speed. And this is in direct contradiction to the literature. As I showed in Hausdorff and others, they show decreased fractality with age. Our group, although not that old, but they were on average between 60 and 75, shows no differences in fractality when we again match our cohorts on levels of physical activity. And again, they were highly physical, well, certainly they had high levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity, so certainly a specific group here. Also, their changes in terms of the split belt paradigm were the same, so no differences in response to the adaptation of the split belt in terms of their fractality, and most importantly, they also showed no differences in our key adaptation measures, both in phase deviation and time to adapt. The old and young group showed no differences. So a very important result from this is that when we control for physical activity levels, we do find inconsistent results. Certainly earlier differences between old and young are eliminated in terms of the fractal dynamics, as well as the adaptation to this split belt paradigm. So in conclusion, when we look at the first point, clearly, and others have made this argument repeatedly, and certainly this is the argument here again, variability can be an important indicator of age-related changes as well as disease, and it still should be used, where increased variability could be a sign of an issue or predictive of falls, but it shouldn't stop there. Okay? Our task, certainly in motor control, and Mark will certainly get into that as well, is to identify the different aspects of variability. First of all, at what level are we analyzing this? Is it at the output level? Is it at the coordinate level of joints or segments? And even at the coordination level, segmental level, some variation will be beneficial and some variation will be detrimental. And ongoing research on uncontrolled manifold, for example, will help us further our understanding about that. Fractals, important, certainly a lot of research on fractals in the area of motor control that continues to show differences between cohorts and groups. But what we need to do, and our study certainly made the beginning, they're certainly not conclusive, is some of the assumptions need to be tested more strongly, and that's what we're starting to do with Scott Duchamp's work in our lab, of really looking at association between fractal dynamics and adaptive gait, or adaptability of gait. And the first studies certainly seem to suggest that at steady state, so that preferred walking is not necessarily indicative of their adaptive capabilities, that we can only get more insight into that relationship when we challenge gait, so like under split belt treadmill conditions. And finally, in terms of aging studies, or even comparing healthy individuals to those with Parkinson's disease or other neurological conditions, we need to really control for factors that, other factors than aging or disease that could impact the differences. And our latest result on looking at these fractal, or comparing fractal dynamics of old and young, and that difference disappearing is a clear indicator for that. Okay? So I'd like to thank, again, first and foremost, Scott for his essential work on fractal dynamics that I presented today, but also my Purdue colleagues, Jeff Haddad, Laura Claxton, and Josh Liddy, Mike Busey is in our department. They were involved in some of the fractal studies and coordination studies with long-lasting relationships and collaborations with Joe Hamill, Robert Wagenaar, and Bart Koepening.